Hello, my name is Emma Yokulis, and welcome to Book Critique number 1. The first book I chose to highlight was Henry's Freedom Box, written by Ellen Levine and illustrated by K. Dear Nelson. The genre for this book is historical fiction, and it can be used for students in grades 3 through 5. Henry's Freedom Box describes the journey Henry makes as a slave. He was born into slavery, but then after a few years gets sold from his family to a new slave master. At this new location, however, he does meet a woman, and they get married and have 3 children. Unfortunately, though, one day Henry's wife and children are sold, leaving Henry alone once again. At this point, Henry is done being a slave, and with the help of his friends, travels through the Underground Railroad and escapes to freedom. The first activity I would do with my students is a social studies activity. I would show the students an interactive map of the different escape routes that the slaves would take in the Underground Railroad. This map also shows the free states and the slave states, and a variety of different routes that the slaves would take during the Underground Railroad. I would discuss with the students the different routes that they would take, which ones were shorter, which ones were longer, which ones seemed the more difficult. And the final question I would ask my students would be, what route, if they were a slave, would they take? This question is meant to give students an idea of going into our activity for this selection. The activity I would have students do would be to create their own escape route. They would pick a starting location and a final destination of freedom. They would map out their own route and post it onto the class Padlet. This is an example of the class Padlet. This is an example of a route that I had created. Just a very brief, very rough sketch of what I would do if I were a slave. It's a rather difficult route, but just a brief idea of what I would want my students to create. And then they would post it onto the class Padlet. The next activity I would have students to do would be an English language arts activity. This would just be a free writing activity. Students would be asked to respond to the prompt, "What do you think happened to Henry?" Students are able to write as much as they want on this topic. They could write about Henry's family, if Henry has a job, whatever they feel happened to Henry. The minimum writing requirement for this would be a paragraph of 5 to 7 sentences. But if students are wanting to, they would definitely be able to write as much as they want and just really be creative. They would write their posts. Students would write their posts in the class Padlet. This is just an example of one I created, a very brief sample of what I thought happened to Henry. I thought that he found 2 of his children, but unfortunately he still wasn't able to find his wife and children. So just an example of what I would create if I were a student, just for the students to view. So those were the 2 activities I would have my students create. And now I'm going to show you the last 4 books that I read for this week, for this book critique. The first book I read was Where the Wild Things Are. This was a book that I loved as a child, so I really wanted to read it for the book critique. It's just a great book, learning about imagination and even different friendships in the book, which is really great. The Little House was another book that I read. It was a book that I had never read before. It was really a cute read. I think students would really enjoy it. We could even bring up the topic of technology and how everything is changing in the world today and different topics like that. The next book I read was The Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins. It talks about the man who he created a lot of different art pieces of dinosaurs, like almost lifelike structures of dinosaurs, just very artistic, very creative. I would love to use this book with the boys in my classroom. I think they'd be really engaged in this book. The only downfall of this book, though, is that it is a little long and it might take them a minute to kind of get engaged in the book, but once they start, it's really interesting. I think the boys would love it. And the final book I read was The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi. This book was really cute, just a really great story, but the part that I loved about the book was the illustrations. The illustrator chose to do all the illustrations in black and white, which was a technique I'd never seen before, but I just thought it was very interesting, and it could even be another way to engage the students. So those were all the 5 books that I chose to read for my book critique this week, and thank you for listening. Have a great day.